can have your attention, we'll go ahead and get this started. I'm going to try to avoid using the microphone. And I do want to start by thanking all of you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here this evening. I know that we all lead very busy lives, and it's often difficult to pull away to do something that maybe isn't always at the top of our priority list. But we're reaching a time in the state of Ohio with public education that we need to start making public education a little bit bigger priority. And before we get started, I just want to give you some background information on how this has gotten started in our district and what's happening across the state of Ohio. About 2 years ago, a select group of districts across the state in various regions, Northeast, Northwest, Central, Southeast, West, and so on, decided to volunteer and sign up for a public advocacy network. And the goal was, how can we build among our constituents, our parents, our taxpayers, broader support and advocacy for public education? And so at LaBrae, I sought out some advice from some parents, some community members, and kind of thought these people could be somewhat of like a superintendent's advisory panel. And a few of them were here this evening. Karen Ansell was one of them. Aaron Young is another one. Michelle Thompson is one. Stacy Beck is one as well, and I know she's here this evening. And then Diana Middleton. And so part of our process has been to talk about those issues that are important to us in education. And if you're paying attention, you have kids in school, or you're an educator, and you're working in a public school setting, you know things like school choice, testing, graduation requirements. Those are all things that have been somewhat in a state of flux over the last few years. So the idea is find issues that are important, and let's see if we can coalesce our community around those issues and do that not just in one district, but try to build a momentum across the state. And so today, it's one of those issues that's at the forefront that came about last spring when two of our legislators introduced, after about 18 months of work, what's called the Ohio Fair School Funding Plan. And that's what brings us here tonight. So I put up here that the time is now to address the issue of school funding. And the reason I put that up there is because we have to have a sense of urgency. Many of us in education have been watching the issue of school funding, for the most part, like wheels in mud. And all we've been doing for decades is spinning our wheels in a lot of mud and not really getting a lot of traction. And what we see before us is currently a proposal that if we can convince the legislature that this is a great place to start. It's not perfect, but it's a great place to start. And if we can convince them that Ohio is demanding this, that we could actually see substantive changes that could be long-lasting. My fear as an educator, having 26 years in the profession, is if we let this moment slip away, I will retire in 10, 11 years from now, and we will still be addressing the issue of school funding, and generations of students across the state will be the victim, and we will continue to see policies that take away opportunity at a public education level and still promote things like school choice and channeling taxpayer dollars to private education. Quite frankly, as a taxpayer, I think my property taxes should only go to support public schools. I do not believe, which is what some people at the state level would have, is that my property taxes should not only support my public school, but they should also support parochial education or private education as well. And that's the road we've been on in the state of Ohio for quite some time. So without further delay, let's go ahead and walk through some things that I think are important as a basis of understanding before we kind of understand where Ohio's headed with this fair funding plan. Okay? So way back in 1976, and bicentennial year, Ohio passed House Bill 920, and property tax revenues and property taxation in the state of Ohio has forever been changed by this. You can remember from the 1970s, hyperinflation, many a great Saturday Night Live skits about inflation rates. I will just tell you this, my wife's grandfather, when I met him, retired from U.S. Gypsy. He was an Ohio State graduate, retired in '73. And he was talking to me about all of his retirement savings. He had it in CDs. And he showed me some of the history. He was getting certificates of deposit at the bank for 11, 12% interest. Today, you can't touch a CD for probably maybe 2.5%, depending on how long you want to lock it up. But hyperinflation of the 70s was also impacting property and the valuations. So what this bill did was it created inflationary protections so that property values during this hyperinflation period did not escalate out of control. Tremendous protection for our property owners and definitely valued over the years when you're paying those property taxes. So basically what it did was it said that as property valuations increase, okay, the millage on those property, millage being a level of taxation, will get rolled back so that a levy will always generate the same dollar. So if a community passes a 3 mil levy and it generates $200,000, 3 years later when those properties are at a higher value, if it only takes 2.7 mils of taxation to generate the same amount of money, then that millage gets rolled back so that it will always generate $200,000. Okay? In essence, that's what House Bill 920 did. Okay? So you have your voted millage, which is your gross. For example, in my example, the 3 mil taxation versus your effective millage. That once your property values increase, the effective millage is that reduced amount. Okay? So property taxes, it's important to understand. A lot of people ask this question: why do we fund schools or townships with property taxes? And the economics behind it is they're considered a great tax because they're elastic. They have great stretch to them. Because during great economic times, obviously, forget 920 for a minute, they're going to generate greater revenue. But to stop that, 920 was put into place. Likewise, during tough economic times, when a period of time you might have depressed values, they're still going to generate revenue, maybe not as much, but they're still going to generate revenue compared to the inelasticity of the income tax. Because people generally are going to always own their property. If you use the income tax, it's not as elastic because during tough economic times, many people can lose their job but still have that property. So from an economic standpoint, property taxes are considered a great source of revenue to fund government. And that's why in the state of Ohio, as is the case with many states, property taxes are the primary source for funding schools. And if you look at your property tax bill, you'll see that it's a general rule of thumb that about 3/4 of your tax goes to public education. And then the rest is split up between other local government entities like the library or your townships and things of that nature. And I should say this, at any point, I can be focused and want to get through some information, but at any point, if you've got a question, just shoot your hand up, because I will gladly, do my best to answer it. And if I don't know, then I'll make sure that I take your information and we do our best to get you an answer. So I don't want this to be a situation where you don't think you can, raise the hand, ask a question, and ask me to elaborate or answer a question that you might have. All right, so 1997, famous case called DeRolf versus the state of Ohio. This is the Supreme Court case that determined that the way we fund schools in Ohio is unconstitutional. So basically what the court said was that when you use a school funding formula that relies solely on the property tax, there's a discriminatory element to that. Okay? You are discriminating because of where someone lives. And I'll show you that in just a minute. So basically the court said it's unconstitutional. You can't discriminate. Now what's interesting is one of the sponsors of this new piece of legislation, Robert Cupp, who's a Republican, was on the Supreme Court at the time this ruling was made, and he was part of this decision. Now he's in the legislature, and he's trying to finally be part of the solution to correct it with appropriate legislation. So, as I said, the quality of your education, the court determined, is based on your zip code. And that's, in some ways, discriminates against children. And here's how I can illustrate that. 1 mil of taxation is 0.001 of a dollar. Okay? So it's 1/10 of 1 cent. Okay? And 1 mil of taxation at LaBrae, based on our property values, this is what we have in our district as taxable property, a little over 112 million, pushing 113 million. At 1 mil will generate $112,000 and some change. In Newton Falls, 1 mil generates $121,927. In Champion, 1 mil generates $173,000. In Lakeview, 1 mil generates $278,000. And in Howland, 1 mil will generate $554,000. So, now there's a lot of circumstantial facts that go into that. But all we're doing is comparing what 1 mil, one rate of taxation, generates in a community. And naturally, that's because of what reason? Why is that different? Property values. We all understand that. It makes perfect sense. But what the state said in the Rolfe decision is that where you live should not determine the quality of the education you get. And thus, since 1997, they've directed the legislature to fix it. And they really have not done that. All right, so before we go any further, as we transition, I do want to share with you, what does our levy picture look like? This is something I share with our board every year. Typically, I do it around January, so I have to do this a little bit in advance. And this is where we get our money from. You've got inside millage, where you can be up to 10 mils of what they call inside taxation. Nobody votes on that except the Board of Education. They determine what the inside millage is. But if you go outside that 10 mil limitation, now you've got to go to your voters. And that's what these are. So, what's interesting about LaBrae is that you'll see we have 27 mil levy, that's an operating levy, 28 mils. We have a 6 mil levy, 76, the second one passed in 81. And then we have a 8.6 mil levy. The last levy we passed, asking for new money, was in May of 1991. We've got a 3 mil permanent improvement levy, which we truly appreciate. That's not for operating expenses. That's for facilities and maintenance. So when we need blacktop or pave, or we put in a projector in a classroom, or we do something with repairing the roof or the gutters, we are using facility money. And that is, trust me, that is a valuable resource for us, because in some districts that do not have a permanent improvement money, when you have to spend $40,000 because a compressor went out on the chiller, that's $40,000 less for kids, for instructional materials, support materials, for technology, software, things of that nature. So it has been my experience that districts that do not have facility money and PI, they sometimes struggle when their facility needs start to get so tough that it cuts into other areas of their budget for educational purposes. So we're blessed in this community that our community has said, hey, that's important to us, and they've continued to support that. And to the tune of about 67, 68% yes vote. So that's a clear message from the LaBrae voters that they support that. Then we, of course, we have our bond, and with that came our half mil maintenance levy. That's for this facility. We cannot spend any of that half mil on Basco. It has to go to this complex. That was the way the levy passage happened with the bond rate in 2001. And so for a total of 55.8 mils, that's the level of taxation at LaBrae. You can go to other districts across the county, and this information is available, and I can surely share it, but you'll have some districts as low as 40 mils, and there are a few that are higher than us. Anybody guess what district in the county has lower property values than our district? Take one wild guess. Possibly, but I was thinking a bigger district, the biggest in the county. Warren City. So Warren City, being a more urban population, has lower property values than us, and I think they are a couple mils above us. But again, they have the same thing. They've got construction bonds because of all the new buildings. They've also got operating money. But here's some smart board members and legislators from years ago. They did a smart thing for us in that they made these levies continuous. And our community was gracious enough to support it. What that means is we don't have to go back and continue to ask our voters to renew those. Now, some voters, I'm sure, would love to have that put up for a vote. But this is one of the reasons why we've had relative stability at LaBrae. All right. So these pay the bills. These pay the electric, the salaries, structural materials. Those three levies are pretty critical. But notice 76, 81, and 91. So why is this important? Well, I think that as an educator and a product of public education, I believe that one of the biggest reasons that it's important is because it's where a great majority of our kids in this country are educated, right within the walls of public education. All right? To me, it's the great equalizer. Doesn't matter what your income background is, who your family is, everybody gets the same opportunity, and public education offers a helping hand and an opportunity to step up for every child who enters those doors. I also think it's important because we have a moral and ethical responsibility to the children in this country. So I'm a believer in that. Economic investment. In a lot of fair funding formula, our legislators will say that, yeah, we need to fix school funding, but we also need to start putting the resources into public education because it's a workforce development issue long term, and we need to stop ignoring that investment. So there's that economic connection to investing in our youth so that our basic skills are where they need to be so the kids have opportunities to advance those skills once they leave. We are not the end-all be-all, and no one who walks through these doors do we think our kids are done once they graduate. We're just the beginning. But there is an economic connection there. Another reason that's important is property taxes. So the 920 implication has resulted in a lot of districts having to go back to their voters pretty frequently. And all you have to do is look at the landscape of Trumbull County. Last year, Niles City had to try to pursue what you call a replacement levy, and it failed. Now I think they're out trying to get their renewals passed. Last spring, our neighbors to the west in Newton Falls tried an income tax levy. And this was, I think, maybe 3 years after they just passed a property tax levy after 23 years in that community. So they tried to pass an income tax levy, an earned income levy. It failed. Now Newton Falls is on the ballot in November for 2 additional levies. One's an operating levy, and one is a permanent improvement levy for their facilities. And those are just 2 of my colleagues, for example, as I know those superintendents and some of their board members, that I understand what they're going through, but you could go back in time and find any district in Trumbull County and know that there was a time where they were generally on the ballot. And in many cases, because of this reduction factor, not that it's a bad thing, but what it does is it stems that growth, and sometimes, depending on cost, you have to go back more frequently than you would like to. So here's one of the reasons it's important for LaBrae. It's hard for me to sit here and tell our community, hey, we don't want to keep coming back to you frequently because we haven't done it. But in some regards, that's a badge of honor, and I'm proud of our boards in past and administration in past and treasurer to be able to say that the taxpayer money at LaBrae has been managed so astutely and smart that we have not been on the ballot frequently, that we haven't been on the ballot in 28 years asking you for more money to help us pay our bills. But when you look at that levy list, we are paying bills in 2019 on valuations from 1991. How many of you could pay your bills today on your salary from 28 years ago? It's kind of hard. And one of the reasons we've done this, and I heard one of our former superintendents say this in a meeting when I worked for another district, he said, if it was not for open enrollment, we would not be as stable as we are. And here's the conversation that myself and the board have sometimes. When is enough open enrollment enough? When does LaBrae no longer become LaBrae? Because we've relied so much on the outside dollar from the surrounding districts of people who want to send their kids here that we're not really LaBrae anymore. We're just a consumer school. And so, but open enrollment has served a purpose, and it's helped us as a district from going back to our voters and saying, hey, we need more money. Because we all understand that's not popular. And we know it's tough. That's critical. So while that's great, I'm not sure how much longer this district can afford to do that. And that's why it's important in our community to say, while we haven't had to necessarily be asked a lot for money, this is important because if we want to keep that stability, we need to see fair funding become law. And my hope is that this becomes law before we do have to come back to our voters. So we think it can stabilize property taxes, and there is a benefit to taxpayers because no one wants to pay more, in property taxes or taxes period. All right, so last operating levy was May of '91, and over the last 9 years or so, Columbus has changed the way we budget money. I know some people in here have got experience with local government. Local government funds were tapped and taken away from townships and villages and used in Columbus to balance the budget and build up our rainy day fund. I can tell you, we had what was called TPP money at LaBrae, and when I first got hired here, the governor's new budget basically said if TPP money, which is a tax on companies' equipment, like in a factory, that was going away. And if your budget represents a small portion of it, then we're taking that away completely in 2 years. Now, LaBrae lost $600,000 in 2 years, $300,000 and some change 1 year, and then in 2012 we lost another $300,000 because the state of Columbus said, it's not a big part of your budget, you don't need it. In addition to cutting townships, library funds, village funds, local governments, and schools are what bore the responsibility of the state being able to take the rainy day fund from 89 cents to whatever it is today, which is over $2.6 billion. So now I say that, and we have Mr. Armstrong from Lordstown in attendance with us tonight. His district in 2005 had a TPP valuation tax revenue of about $2.1 million. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And that's been taken away gradually because it was a bigger part of their budget. The state has phased in those phase out. They didn't cut them so quickly. But I know he could probably agree, he doesn't anticipate that money being there much longer. And that's why I know he knows this is important to his district as well. And when you lose that money, what Columbus has said is go back to your voters. Because in the last 9 years, that's what we've heard. So, go to your voters. Well, guess what? Our voters are saying enough's enough. And that's a serious issue that we have to listen to. That you just can't say, well, we need more money, we're going to spend recklessly because we can always go to our voters. We trust that our voters are going to hold us to account and say, well, show us why you need it. All right? So that's why this is important. Stable property values, obviously keeping taxes at bay, and I'll also say this, because I think it's a part of our message, is making Columbus step up to pay their fair share. We talk about who has the greatest resources to be able to fund schools appropriately. Well, when you take all these factors into consideration, it's a state government versus a local government. And so some of that state share is what we're talking about. Not saying there's not a need for local taxation, because some communities will continue to do that. But it's about getting the state to step up and fix the system and fund education. So, grassroots advocacy for education. We want to establish, as I said at the outset, a network of people that when important issues come up, they get informed about them, they get motivated, and we use our networks to communicate our voice as voters. So I put this up there. We want to educate. We want to become informed about issues, whether it's graduation and graduation requirements. I think we're on our third set of graduation requirements in the last 5 years. Okay? So a lot of changes there. Went from passing a lot of tests to saying, well, you don't have to pass as many tests, and here's some other criteria. Or maybe it's something like testing in general. How many parents in here, your kids, anybody have kids get stressed out over those state tests or not? I see some head nods. I see some hands going up. We all at some point, maybe in our professions, have had to take tests, and tests can be valuable. But we are awesome at producing a nation of test takers. That's just where I am. I mean, the more they change the standards, when I first got to LaBrae, I said, hey, we just a little bit of work differently, and we are close to being an excellent district. Who doesn't want that label of being excellent? Love it. And our teachers, we did some things differently. We maybe focused in on some data, and I think within a matter of 2 years, our report card went to excellent. Then they changed the report card. Then they changed the test. And then they changed the standard. Hey, you got a lot of kids here, you're doing well, but now you need to get them up here. And I understand college career readiness. It makes a lot of sense. But at some point, how much can you keep raising the bar to the point where the bar is unachievable? I'm somewhat athletic, but you're not going to give me a 40-inch high jump, right? And it's just not going to happen. I might get lucky and hit 30, but there reaches a point where the bar, based on where we are at the high school level, what we're asking kids to do, you can't expect college and career readiness of where you expect them to be at 25 when they're only 17, 18 leaving high school. So, it's about looking at those issues, and this particular issue happens to be, that we're trying to coalesce around and motivate people is school funding. So, and then lastly, we need to make our voices heard, and that's the reason for this meeting, to educate a little bit, try to give a sense of urgency and motivate people to say, yeah, we need to make this known that we want to see this fixed. You can read I read an editorial this morning, the Toledo Blade saying, get it right, Ohio, the time is now. Get this right. This is a great start. You can read them coming out of the Dispatch. You can read them coming out of the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Dayton Daily News. There's a lot of growing sentiment for Ohio to finally fix the school funding formula. And here's why we know this works. How many of you a few years ago, going back to the topic of testing, will remember the PARCC test? A non-educated, please. Don't, no teachers raise their hand. So, but across the state of Ohio, and this happened even at LaBrae, we didn't get as many as some other states, but we had a few informed parents, and parents were saying, call in my office. First they called the principal, and the principal would say, hey, you got to call Mr. Culver. They called me and said, my kid's not taking the test. They're fired up. They're just not doing it. They don't have to. They're not taking the Ohio Achievement Test. They're not taking that PARCC test. And you're right, as a parent, you have that right. Okay, we talked through it, and then we had probably a half dozen kids not take the test. But across the state of Ohio, not just at LaBrae, hundreds of thousands of parents were letting Columbus know our kids aren't taking the test. And so what did the legislature do? When parents rose up, when the community started to speak, they got rid of the PARCC test. Okay? I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but it was a very political cycle. And the Common Core is what really was driving people. Because people were seeing Common Core on Facebook and Common Core in the news, and there's all kinds of spoofs about it, about how this is, you can probably still find them today, that's stupid math, this is the way we taught math, or this is the way we learned and it worked for us. So you can find all of that on the internet, but that's what was driving it. And so what did the state of Ohio do? They listened to parents. They got rid of the PARCC. Where'd the Common Core go? Educators? Nowhere. It's still here. We're still teaching the Common Core, but our people in the General Assembly listened to parents and said, oh, we got to get rid of this PARCC test, because the voters were associating PARCC. So we got rid of PARCC, that bad, nasty name, right? But we still have the Common Core, and that's what those are the standards we're still teaching today. We just call it something different. We call it the Ohio Achievement Assessment, okay? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn from those lessons and say, if we can get parents to motivate the state on testing to that level, why can't we generate that public advocacy on other important issues? And that takes us back to a couple years ago when we started to try to build these networks. All right. So in a nutshell, this is kind of what school funding typically looks like in the state of Ohio. Yes, sir?
Before you get any further, your comment about open enrollment, the last thing you said about it was very contradictory.
Okay.
So can you clear up that?
Can you help me what I said? Because
you said, we don't know how long we can afford to keep going open enrollment going, but you have been saying, right or wrong, it's been putting dollars in.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so let me clarify that. So his question is, apparently something I said sounded contradictory about it. We don't know how long we can keep it going. And then you're associating that with open enrollment. Here's what I hope was articulated, so thank you very much. What I am saying is we don't know how long we can keep going without going back to our voters for asking for additional money. We do supplement our revenue with open enrollment, but we're very conscious not to have too much open enrollment because we understand when you're 17-18% of your student body as open enrollment, the board and I have had discussions, we think that's a good number. And when you start to get more than that, then the concern is when are we no longer LaBrae? So to answer your question and for clarity, we don't know how much longer we can keep going without going back and asking for more money. Because if the solution is just bring in more open enrollment students, that's going to change the dynamic in our buildings. Okay? And that's a concern of the Board of Education. So that's why that solution's kind of off the table. We just can't open the floodgates because to be honest with you, it's a really dicey political issue. You know, having a lot more open enrollment kids. Parents, and rightly so, I understand it. They don't like to see, opportunities taken away from their own children. They understand the value of open enrollment, but there's also community members who are long-standing community members who have said, hey, we should be closed. We should just be LaBrae, and it should just be LaBrae people. So that's where politics come into play, because you hear both sides of those stories. But thank you very much. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked for the clarity. So here's why it's a very complex issue. Because every year, the state does this. They say, how much can we afford to fund for schools? What did we fund last year? Okay, we might inflate that number a little bit. Last year, I'm just making stuff up. But it's a good educated guess. I'm not completely making it up. Hey, it was $8.2 billion last year. We can afford tax coffers look good. Let's put another $700 million. We'll go to $8.9 billion this year. And so they'll just set that allocation. And then remember, they're creating a 2-year budget, and they'll determine every 2 years how to distribute that. And there are no 2 years where the distribution funds are the same. They're always putting in special factors based on this is how much we've set. When we run the numbers, that doesn't work. Let's change a multiplication factor here. Let's adjust this ratio so that we can ensure we stay within that set amount of money. Right? And what you end up having is a bunch of winners and losers. So, for example, some districts in our state are what you call on the guarantee, because here's what they did to LaBrae, not this budget cycle, but the last one. Governor Kasich made a proposal in his budget that said, if you've lost more than 5.5% of your population in 15 and 16, then we're going to have an accelerator reduction that'll reduce your funding even more. And that's what happened for us. It pushed us so close to the guarantee that when we lost some additional enrollment that year, somewhere mid-year, it was in 2017, I believe, we kicked on to the guarantee when we lost like 10 kids. And what does that mean? That means that the state had a formula in place that basically said, you're not going to get any less money than that. So about 4 years ago, we were getting about 8.3 million. And when the guarantee kicked in, we're at 7.7 million in state aid. All right? So that's an example of that reduction. But that's an example of LaBrae being a loser based on some special calculation, because they wanted to make sure that in this distribution, nobody lost or received any less money than they received the year before. Now, they had to do that because they didn't want to see too much pain, but in order to pay for it, they had to also cap some people. So there's additional losers. The people at the top, whose populations are growing so fast, or whose revenues were capped with a special factorization because they had to have a way to say, well, you can't make that much money. You can't experience a 10.5% growth in your state foundation, so we're going to cap you, and I can't remember the figure because we're not capped, but I want to remember it was around 7.5%. It's what they call a gain cap. Am I in the ballpark? About 7? All right. So, people on the cap, people on the guarantee, they're the losers. And if you're a district that's not growing too fast, or losing population too fast, well, then you're kind of a winner because you're on that funding formula. But what happens is, 2 years later, it changes. And so for this budget cycle, everybody's foundation is frozen, and now we have this other special pot of money called wellness dollars. It's completely different, and there's strings on how you can spend those dollars as well. So that happens every 2 years, and that's the complexity of it. So they create a 2-year budget, yet school districts have to budget for 5. So we only know for certain 2 years out what our finances will look like. So what the Fair School funding model does is it comes up with a consistent funding mechanism, and it has consistent distribution formulas. So that if you know your enrollment and you know the percentage of what the state's going to fund it, you can reliably predict what your funding is going to be. And it's based on one thing. What are the inputs to educating a kid in the state of Ohio? That's what it tries to accomplish. It's kind of an economic model of, you own a company and you make widgets. What are the factors of production, the resources to go into making that widget so that it can get to sale? Well, that's what Ohio tried to do. So Cup & Patterson, with treasurers, superintendents, economists, 18 months, devised some cost basis of what it costs to educate students in the state. So this underscores the point. We're going to get to that cost in just a minute. We have 610 public school districts. 503 of them are either capped or on the guarantee. And it's clear evidence when only 18% of your districts are on the formula, getting their calculated formula. But the formula really isn't a school funding model. It's just a way to distribute dollars. And there's winners and there's losers. And the winners are 18% of the districts in the state. You can go to Olentangy or Upper Arlington, and they'll tell you they're losing because their populations are growing so fast, they can't get enough funding. So we're on the guarantee, but districts like that are exploding in central Ohio, and they're still one of these right here because the state's saying, oh, not so fast. Okay? So when 18% of your districts are not, or the only districts on the formula, it's kind of evidence that this formula really isn't that effective. Okay, so here's what the Fair Funding Plan tries to do. They want to define what's it cost to educate every child. They want to ensure that all students can achieve their greatest potential, regardless of their economic circumstances, regardless of that school district's property wealth. You get the same access and equity. Provide for a fair and stable formula that does not favor one district over another. And then fund it. Get the dollars to where the kids are. So I'll give you one example. The state of Ohio, under this plan, would fund charter schools directly. And this is an important lesson, I think, for taxpayers to be aware of. When a kid decides not to go to LaBrae, and they go to Buckeye Online School of Learning, that's a charter school, it's a public school by the state. The state of Ohio, based on this nice formula that we're not getting too deep into, we get $4,200 for each kid. Okay, that's what it boils down to. So $4,200 comes to LaBrae, but A.J. Calderon's parents send him to Buckeye Online Learning. Okay? And I'm a LaBrae student. LaBrae sends $6,100 to Buckeye Online Learning. The difference there is about $1,900 if my math is correct. Who's paying that $1,900 difference? It's not the state. It's the local property taxpayer of LaBrae local schools. We're funding that difference because we're losing that $1,900 that has to be sent to the charter, and it's coming from our local resources. So a lot of taxpayers aren't aware that they fund and subsidize the difference in that state foundation gap. And in some districts, it's even bigger. Some districts, it's $4,000 difference or more. So what this would do is say, look, wherever the kids are, we're going to educate them there. So the state's even saying that in this fair funding formula, we're just going to have to pay for charters directly. If that's important to Columbus, then they'll fund it. Now, naturally, it's got everybody thinking, well, what's that going to mean for us? Because are they going to cut our funding to be able to fund it? But I'll put our district up against any charter at any time. And, over the course of the last decade, we've averaged anywhere between $300,000 and $550,000 in lost revenue to charter schools. And hopefully I can see some changes, but that's something that we're seeing more and more parents experience with charters and then realize that it didn't quite turn out the way they thought, and then they come back. And that's always a nice thing to be able to welcome those students back to our community. So this is the goal of what it's trying to accomplish. This is the breakdown of where they're putting the funding. They're trying to drive 60% of the dollars to classroom instruction, 20% to school operations, which is building level operations and support, 15% for instructional and student supports, and then 5% for district leadership. So when you look at this, which all of you have a copy of it, if you didn't, we can get it to you. This is what they're calling the base cost. This is a real school district. I think it's Trimble Local Schools in Ohio. Not too far off from LaBrae, as you can see that their head count on enrollment is about 768, and we're about 1,050. Okay? So, what this tries to do, and I can't see this cleanly, and that's why I wanted to print it out so you can see it, is they try to come up with a ratio. So they come up with class size ideals. What's the recommended research-based amount of what our class sizes should look like when it comes to the number of teachers versus the number of students, that ratio, student-to-teacher ratio. And so they say in kindergarten, for example, 20. And in this district, at the time they used this data, they had 57 kids in kindergarten. The state would fund 2.9 teachers, is what that ratio would be. Now, keep in mind, as I put up here, the ratios drive the funding, but they don't prescribe that you have to have 3 teachers. They don't prescribe that you have to have 2. This local community could say, that's what we're getting funded for, but we'll use local revenue to go beyond that. We wouldn't be too far off. We might be, I'm just going to guess, and say based on about 72 kids or whatever we got in kindergarten, we might be like 3.5. But our board has said that it's a priority to keep kindergarten's classroom sizes low because of when our kids come to us, how big is the gap that we have to close? Many of our kids come to us and they are ready to learn. But we have a number of kids that come to us and they are nowhere near ready to learn. Okay? So our board recognizes that based on what our building administrators tell us and what our teachers tell us, and they say it's important to keep that ratio low. We're around 15 per kindergarten class, but then we start to get bigger. So they use these ratios to determine the ideal funding amount. What's the ideal class? What's your head count? Here's your ratio. This district would get funding for 31.2 teachers. Doesn't mean they can't have more. Doesn't mean they can't have less. They could have less. But that's what the state will fund you for. So they looked at the average teacher income or the teacher wages that are being paid out, including benefits. They came up with a number, and they used that to say, okay, here's the cost of a teacher. Go back to that input that I mentioned earlier. What's it cost to put a teacher in front of a kid? Ohio has that data, and we are using it to help drive how we're funded. So, here's some other examples. Other direct instruction. We got specials, art teachers, music teachers, phys ed teachers. They said we're going to do one of those teachers, a special, per 150. So this district would get 6 of those teachers funded based on that ratio. They also factor in what are districts spending on substitute teachers? And they pay you for that. They've allocated 5 days of funding per teacher, saying, teachers, okay, we're going to assume on average 5 days a year per teacher, we'll fund you for 5 substitutes. And they're not leaving any stone unturned. Hey, there's professional development costs. Sometimes we have to send teachers to professional development or close schools so that we can bring in teams to facilitate professional development. They factored in that cost. So they come up with, and this is 60%. 60% of the cost in this funding model is towards classroom instruction and professional development. 15% is instructional. Co-curriculars. They're considering what it costs to run your co- and extracurricular programs and saying that's part of the educational experience that communities and parents want for their kids. High school guidance support, they're going to fund it. Safety and security, looking at implementing a cost basis for security plans and safety equipment and implementing that. Library and media operations, obviously supplies and academic content. But look at this, social, emotional, security, and life support. 1 per 250 students. Instructional technology, and they give us a flat amount per pupil. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. I can direct you to all the resources out there, and you can read about this. But they are trying to look at every possible input and determine a cost, and then trying to fund it. And then you got school operations, building leadership, 1 per 450 kids. You can have more, but 1 per 450 in this district, they would fund 1.7 principals, plus the support teams of secretaries and other staff to support that building operation. And then every district by law, you've got superintendent, treasurer, you've got fiscal support, EMIS support. There's a lot of data to manage there. And so as a result, they come up with ratios there, and they determine what the funding should be. And that's what they call the base cost. That's the base inputs that it takes to educate kids, and then they're going to put a number to it. So again, ratios to determine appropriate staffing and supports. Those ratios drive the funding. Although you're free, it's only funding. It's not a prescription that you got to spend it this way. And then you still have local control. And there will be districts. If this ever becomes law, I'm going to tell you it won't be enough in the Chagrin Fallses. It won't be enough in Solon. It won't be enough in Westerville. Those communities are still going to support their schools with additional local revenue. That's just going to happen. But what it does do is it helps those communities not have to bear the burden of the district, hopefully always coming back to them for additional funds. Okay, so you got your base cost, and then you have your add-ins, or your add-ons. What do you do when a district has higher levels of poverty? LaBrae has about a 56% free and reduced lunch rate. The governor's on record saying it takes more money to educate poor communities. They recognize the same dollar doesn't go as far in LaBrae as it might in a Solon. So that's an add-on. There's going to be special factors. Special education. By law, you got to educate special education students. They deserve the same access to education. It's a federal requirement. But I can tell you right now, we have 2 special ed students from LaBrae that are off campus at a unit, and they require a one-on-one aid all day long, $50,000 each. 2 students, $100,000. They need it. Their programming requires it. But I just want you to understand and underscore the illustration that when you're required by law to do that, and we would never want to discriminate against our most disadvantaged students, $100,000, that gets gobbled up pretty quick. So that's just one example of how the state would say, we recognize special ed has really different costs. And do you know what the state gave us back on one of those aids as a reimbursement? A little over $4,300. So when we applied for catastrophic reimbursement, Columbus gave us $4,300. So the state recognizes got to step that up. Gifted, STEM, open enrollment, chart, all of these are areas, transportation is another big one, that they're looking at to say, we know that there's additional needs beyond the base cost. And then the key question is, how do you distribute the money? And that's where this comes into place. So what they have done is they've determined that using some averages, because you want to smooth those out, you don't want to do it just based on 1 year of data, because property values fluctuate, incomes definitely fluctuate, that we're going to distribute the money based on a 60-40 ratio. And we're going to consider both of them together. And they come up with a special distribution model where 60% of the emphasis is based on the property values and 40% is based on what's the resident income. And that's, of course, based on all tax returns and the access that they have to that data through the IRS. So, and again, this is going to be based on 2 and 3 year smoothing periods because you don't want great fluctuations, but that's how the formula would distribute the money to the various school districts. And so with the new fair funding plan, you got something that's predictable, you have something that's reliable, It's something that can be sustained over time, and it's very scalable. Representative Patterson, he had said in many meetings, and he's a former teacher, he said nothing will sabotage a funding formula like a recession. And that's another reason why the time is now. In August, the state of Ohio collected $90 million more in 1 month than expected. Tax revenues in the state of Ohio have Ohio in a position where our legislators in Columbus are feeling like if there's a time to do this, we got to do it while the revenues are strong. And what Mr. Patterson would say is it's very scalable. So that based on those economic times, you can scale that percentage of what level you can fund it. But the formula still is predictable and reliable. And then when economic times are back on the upswing, you can scale it back up so we can keep doing this long term. Right? That's the idea. And so under this plan, you get 100 guaranteed districts out of the 610, with about 84% of the districts being funded on a formula, something that works for more districts than not. And by 2021, we'd achieve that number. Now, you can imagine, and I know, if you're a numbers person, you're thinking, how do we pay for it? Well, that's a big issue. And that was one of the reasons it didn't make it into the new budget this year in July. Because there's questions on how does Ohio pay for this? Now, one of the things that they did when they reintroduced this bill as House Bill 305 is they said, let's phase it in over 6 years as opposed to 4. So it won't be fully funded until 6 years out. Because they knew that that would be a more gradual increase and a burden on the state budget and would give the legislature time to adapt. So how to fund it is an issue. But there is conversation in Columbus about how to do that. And if you wanted to talk individually about that, we could, but I'm not going to belabor that point. So in a nutshell, here's what it looks like for LaBrae and every other school in Trumbull County. When this bill got taken out of the budget, because it was too soon, they reintroduced it in July as House Bill 305. And this was working under the assumption that it would get put into place this year. We are currently in fiscal year 20. Next year's fiscal year 21. Remember, this is not exactly off of what we currently get. There are some other numbers behind this, but this number, if it was in place right now, LaBrae would be getting $8.4 million. And that's $398,000 above an earlier projection. And that's what that number represents. The second year of the budget, that number, based on this formula, would increase us another $310,000. You can see what that does for every district in the county. Okay? So, what I would share with you when you look at this is that, again, you can look at those numbers and say, hey, that's just Trumbull County. How does Ohio come up with that? But they're having those conversations, like I said, among the legislators. But the conversations are better now than they've ever been. Because when this bill got reintroduced, 66 members of the House signed on to say, I want to be a co-sponsor. That's Republican and Democrat. We have more bipartisan support right now for this funding plan than we've ever had. Back in March, when this was first introduced, many would say, hey, that was a pipe dream. But as people see the writing on the wall and the need to invest in public education and to fix a system that's unconstitutional, there's more support. But they know it's a heavy lift because it's nowhere near a done deal. But here's what I would say about LaBrae. When I first got here, we had 95 teachers. We now have 85. And I'll be the first to tell you, we don't need to be as big as we used to be when we had 1,400 kids. But every time someone retires or leaves us, the first question we ask is, do we even need this position? And I think that's a disservice to some degree to kids. Because what we should be asking is, how can we repurpose this position to something that is more needed, to something that is more modern, to something that helps our kids have the tech, the media skills, whatever those things might be that makes our students more college and career ready. That's what we should be asking ourselves. I will say this. We have, I don't think she made it tonight. Is Sharon Harper here? She's one of my other advisors on my little panel. That woman is amazing. because she runs on this campus for over 220,000 square feet in 2 different buildings. And when her and Mr. Kelly did CPR on that student in middle school, she came all the way from Basque. Now, I'm not saying we need 2 full-time nurses, but there was a time when we had, 1.5 nurses. Or, could we possibly do something creative with dollars that makes sure that, we're in a better position to meet those emergency cases? So when one teacher retires, wouldn't it be great to say, hey, we have a need for this program over here. So let's, instead of keeping that person and filling it, maybe we need to put this person in a different position and hire someone new to fill that void. So we're using those dollars a little more judiciously. But no, because we're always in this state of mind that we have to do more with less, our first thing is we got to cut. Or if we can afford to, not replace. And I'm not convinced that that's always good for our kids. All right? So when you have a sustainable or hopefully predictable source of revenue without fear that it's going to be a roller coaster ride all the time, that you're at 8.3 and then 2 years later you're at 7.7, you got a little breathing room to be able to plan more long term than having to make those rash decisions. And trust me, as I sit here today, we will have teachers retiring and we're asking ourselves questions, and I'm doing research. Is there a need to replace them or not? So those are answers that we'll get over the next several months, but that's the dilemma we're in. Now, I will also fully acknowledge we need to ask ourselves those questions, because we know that our taxpayers expect us not. We don't have to be so large that we're not responsible. So we have to find that balance of what's responsible, what's also good for students and good for our community, because we represent a broad base of constituents. But you can see, this is the first 2-year budget. And remember, I said earlier, if it's fully phased in over 6 years, you have some ability to plan long term and some expected resources to deal with it. Now, I just want to offer one caveat. The General Assembly released the fully funded figures last week, and they are on the General Assembly website. Lakeview is not going to be stuck in this rut. Just initially they are, as it gets phased in because of their property and income wealth. When you look at Lakeview's final numbers, their revenue is trending upwards as well. So we'll go back to that claim that this doesn't pit districts against one another. All districts in Trumbull County will benefit. So what do we do now? What's next? I wanted to try to give you a snapshot of, what's some of the LaBrae funding facts, how are we impacted, and why is this important to us? And then, what do we do from here? So what's next is to, if you're looking for more information, I would direct you to this website. And you can just Google Ohio Fair School Funding. You don't have to remember all this. Just Google it, and that'll pop up that website. Their website looks like this. There's a bunch of different links on it. That's their Twitter page. And you can find all sorts of, background information. Okay? Another step is to say, hey, I want more information. I can share that information with you. We have computers up here where you can log into a quick Google form, give us first name, last name, your email address, because we have to find a way to be an advocate and then use our own personal networks to kind of spread that word that this is an important issue in the state of Ohio. That we got to find a way to fix a 22-year-old school funding formula that over-relies on property taxes, places a big burden on property owners, and doesn't make Columbus step up with its fair share. That's critical. But we can't do that without the power of population, without the power of the masses. So it's using our own personal network to say, hey, I'm going to register and I want more information, so I'm going to shoot Mr. Calder an email. Or, for example, I will tell you this, I talked to a couple legislators, and before I wanted to come in here, I said, I want to get the truth. Hey, all that mail that you guys get, regular mail, email, does that stuff even work? You even read it? And the responses that I got were this. Typically, legislative aides will print off every email, and of course they get all the letters, and then they will read it. And one legislator told me, he says, typically, I will read the emails, and when I see third or fourth email in that I'm getting some of the same language on the same topic, then I just get into counting mode. In other words, I'm looking at how much is coming in, the volume. He says, we pay attention to it. And he used this example. He said there was a public employees retirement system in the state of Ohio, and I can't remember who that covers, if that includes firefighters or just public employees, but he says there was a cost of living freeze that they were going to do in the last budget cycle. He said, but the outpouring of angst against that inflationary freeze for their COLA was so strong, he said it was dead on arrival. He said because they got so much response from people who pay into that PERS who are already members of PERS. So from a couple of legislators that I spoke with, just to confirm, they do listen, they do count, and they are paying attention. And a lot of times if they're not hearing about a topic, they assume nobody cares. So that's where what I'm asking is there a way for us to become advocates, use our network, and spread the word to try to get our voices heard in Columbus? So if I, we'll end on, hey, what does it do? It's fair for students. I think it's fair for districts. It's fair for property owners. And we're just trying to make sure that Ohio's children, we make a proper investment to ensure quality opportunities, and that, standing up, Ohioans can make a difference. A lot of issues show that when people stick together and make their voice heard, we can accomplish great things. And what we're hoping to do is across the state with our networks is to make that voice heard in Columbus from all corners of the state to say it's time to fix this because we have the resources to do it. So, questions, comments, anybody? I was close. I tried to keep it to an hour. I told one person today, don't worry, Steelers kick off at about 8:25. I respect football fans who want to be home and see Monday Night Football. Any questions? Okay, so what I would ask, no pressure, you can email me later if you want, but if you have a few minutes and you say, hey, I want more information, or I want to, sign up to be on that email list, you can do that. It takes 5 minutes, first name, last name, email. Yes, ma'am?
Would you tell us what legislators you would like us to contact?
Yes. I do not want to be so presumptuous to say, here's how you do it. But I will be so presumptuous to say, if you ask me, I'll help you. Because I've got an entire list, and we keep a database of all the legislators, and we mail merge letters to them all the time on issues. And here, on that note, here's my philosophy. I'm trying to learn the skills that we ask our teachers and students to use. I'm using some video technology, and I have piloted this, tested it once. I am actually recording my desktop using a program called Screencastify. And I know some of our teachers, they know what that is. I'm learning it. And I'm recording how you can email legislators by copying and pasting. And it'll be about a 5-minute video, and I'm going to post it to our YouTube channel. And one of the things that I'm going to do is send that YouTube channel link out to anybody who wants it. And I would encourage you to post it to your Facebook, email it to your friends and family, because it is going to be a simple, write a 75-word message on school funding or any other matter, and then copy it into the website form. Make sure it says Senator O'Brien, send. Open up another legislator, paste it in again, send. One time on a particular issue, I emailed the entire Finance Committee of the Ohio House within 15 minutes doing that. Same message, just change the salutation, and I hit send. So in a short period of time, they don't all have to be physical letters. But here's my point. Democrats from this area are in agreement with what we're trying to do. But there's no reason Republican leadership in the Ohio House should not hear from people in Northeast Ohio. So if you're Representative Olschlager, who's the finance chair of the Ohio House, and that bill, House Bill 305, is sitting in his committee, he should hear from people in Trumbull County. And I generally tend to think they will at least acknowledge it and listen. Same thing can be said with Larry Householder. Larry Householder is a Republican Speaker of the House. His wife is a teacher. He has been in meetings and said, it is one of my goals to fix school funding. We have Republicans who previously wouldn't even dream of thinking that they would be a part of a school funding fix that are now saying, I want to help lead the charge. That's what's different in Ohio today. So my message would be that we've got to not only reach out to our locals, we've got to reach out to the Republicans in committee chairs and leadership positions and let them know the same message that we're sharing with Mike O'Brien in the House, or Gil Blair in the House, or Sean O'Brien in the Senate. So right now this bill is sitting in the House. We got some work to do. And then eventually around January, the hope is that we'll move into the Senate. We do know one thing. Mr. Patterson said that it's unlikely to be included in the July update. So we're looking at the next budget 2 years away. That's our goal, is to get something in place with an effective date of July 2021 would be the goal. But great question. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Hey, again, I can't thank you enough for being here. I'm pleased to know that enough people listen to my pleas or requests to say this is important. It's very critical that citizens stand up for what they believe in. And, you know, somewhere along the way, some teacher taught me how to read and write. Some teacher taught me how to critically think. They taught me how to put proper sentence structure together. They taught me some math that, yes, to this day I still use in some level. And if I'm not using it directly, I'm using it within the technology that I use. And I know looking back on it, I can put those names and faces together. But I look at it and sometimes I think, where would I have been without my mother and those people who nurtured me on those days where she wasn't there with me for that 7.5 hours a day? Public education creates a lot of great opportunity, and I hope you'll find the same value in it that I do, and I hope you'll be willing to advocate for it in this critical issue and then other issues moving forward. But again, I am pleased to know that enough people thought, yeah, this is an important issue and we want to be here to hear about it. So thank you for that. Thank you for caring, and I hope that you'll join us in this fight. So thank you for being here. You guys have a good night.